us will know of the mystery writer Agatha Christie. She was married to an archaeologist, and she once made the comment that an archaeologist was the best person in the world to be married to, because the older she got, the more interested he was in her. We're in the midst of a 6-week sermon series about marriage. And before we took a 1-week break for Thanksgiving last weekend, we learned some of the characteristics of a Christian marriage, and if there was nothing else to get out of that, it was this. That to have a proper, healthy Christian marriage, you needed to live as a Christian. That was the bottom line. Simple. Well, simple till you try to live it. Because it is complicated as well, because in a Christian marriage, as in any marriage, we're bringing together that which is different. And women and men come from different points of view and start in different places. There was a movement for a couple of decades there that said the differences between men and women were strictly cultural. That if you were to take 2 children and you were to raise them identically, there would be no difference between boys and girls. And we've come, as time has gone on, to understand that there is a little bit of truth in that. There are things that come up because of cultural differences, but just because there are certain truths in that does not make it true as a whole. And for the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about men and women. Know that both genders have this absolutely, completely in common. That we are all created by God in His image to know His salvation and to know and to spread His love. That is an absolute truth. But we also approach life slightly different. Now granted, obviously, there's more similarities than there are differences between men and women. However, God did create us with differences. And despite what some have tried to say over the years, they're not wrong, those differences. It is not wrong for a man to live like a male. And it is not wrong for a woman to live like a female. And while that may sound silly to say, there have been those who said that that is true. But some of the over-the-top characteristics also have been. You ever kind of watch TV sitcoms over the years? You go back to the early days of TV, back in the 50s and 60s, and often the whole comical part of a TV sitcom in that era was the ditzy housewife. And it was a portrayal of a woman who often never quite had it together. But then we swung to another extreme. We watched the sitcoms, particularly go to the late 80s, 90s. And then we had the inept, klutzy male. And that was the brunt of all jokes. Both are unfortunate because it should not be about put-downs. See, Christian marriage is about overcoming. It is loving despite differences. It is learning to accept that I am a sinner. My partner is a sinner. But together we grow towards Jesus. So we're going to start with myself getting into some trouble. That's what it says on the outline in the back, and a few people immediately wanted to know what that's all about. It's because we're going to hit a very controversial thing. It's a very divisive little passage. And some very good people have come up with very different positions on the whole area of gender roles. And I'm going to approach this. I've studied, I've read, come to the decision. There's no way I can preach this without getting into trouble, but I'm going to preach it anyway. So don't hate me too bad at the end. But I'm going to be in trouble right away. Because I know that the best sermons come out of one's experiences. And today I'm going to preach about being a woman. I have no experience with that at all. Sorry, but I can't help it. It's the way that it is. There was a young son who walked up to his dad and said, "Dad, I've heard that in some parts of Africa, a man does not know his wife until he marries her." And the father very wisely said, "That's true in all countries." There is true mystery in marriage. The part of what I read earlier that we're going to focus on is this: wives, submit to your own husbands, as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. As I started preparing for this sermon, I realized there's a lot here. And we're not going to cover this as deeply as maybe we should. And there's some controversial statements in this that we're not actually even going to get to. But we're going to try. We'll have to talk about marriage as a partnership. But then a lot of people read this and say, this doesn't sound very much like a partnership, does it? I almost switched and did. The men verses come after the woman verses. And I almost switched it, the order that we were going to do this sermon, because we almost have to understand and be reminded again that there are roles for both men and women, and they're both very difficult. In fact, the men's roles are probably harder. But this one just doesn't sound like the year 2012. We need to understand this in its context. Immediately before these verses, we read, and I read way back because it's important to understand the context. But if you go back, it's talking about live filled with the Spirit. Submit to one another. And then it goes on from here to talk about the men have an important role in the marriage as sacrificers, as Christ is sacrificed for his church. And men are given huge instructions. If we just take these verses on their own, and many have, we could make an argument that these are verses to put a woman in her place. And many have taken these verses out of context and done just that. I think we have to go back a little further in our scripture. So if you go right back to the very beginning, when God created male and female, we find that Adam needed a helper. And Eve was created as that helper. Now right away, is this going to get me out of trouble quoting those verses? Was woman just created to be an assistant? No. I love to study Scripture in depth. I brought along with me a book. It's called the Concordance. What a concordance does is it takes a word and it tells you all the times that you can find that word in the Bible. I love that. So I took my handy-dandy concordance this week and I looked up the word helper. Very interesting study. We find it twice in the book of Genesis, both having to do with Adam and Eve. I will make a helper suitable for him. For Adam found no suitable helper. We find things like that. Listen to some of the other places where we find the word helper. It's really important. Exodus. My father's God was my helper. Deuteronomy. God is your shield and helper. Psalm 10. You are the helper of the fatherless, speaking of God. Psalm 27. You, speaking of God, have been my helper. Psalm 118:7. The Lord is with me, he is my helper. Hosea. Speaking about people who are opposed to God. You are against me, against your helper. Hebrews 13. The Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. There's only one occasion after the book of Genesis where the word helper is used for somebody other than God, and that is in Nehemiah, where we find that they are reconstructing the walls of Jerusalem, and there's one person who's there stacking the bricks, and there's another person who's there as a helper holding a weapon because there were bad guys about. Interesting, eh? Do you think helper is a negative word if it's just used about God and Eve, and that one other occasion? I don't think it's a very negative word at all. What was the point of a helper in these scriptures? It was one who was a completer and a protector. Protector. I have to get annoyed because my wife is always making sure that I don't look foolish when I walk up on stage or anywhere else. That's part of protecting, isn't it? How often do I do it the other way around? Part of the role is protector. Fortunately, after Eve is created as the protector, the helper, the completer, we have the fall into sin. And all of a sudden, instead of being protectors and helpers and sacrificers, we have Adam and Eve falling into the role of accusers and fault makers. But then we come to these verses. These are the words that are on the screen behind me are hard in the year 2012. Because the key word we find there is to submit. I looked up this week, what does this word mean? I found there were dozens, literally dozens of words in the Greek that could have been used for submit. The one that is used here is to bring into control. Bring into control. Well, that doesn't sound very nice. But we have to put this in some sort of context. Wives, submit. Notice it does not say, husbands, make your wives submit. Women, bring yourself to do this yourself. We have a bizarre notion that we find throughout the theology of the New Testament, something that does not fit with human nature, and that is this. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. The meek shall inherit the earth. Jesus is crucified and rejected so that he can be raised up over all of creation. We're told here that women play their role so that they may be like the church. And somebody might right away say, do you mean that I always do as my husband wants me to do so I can be first in the kingdom of heaven? I don't think that's quite what it's after, honestly. There have been many who have come to these verses and say, wife, you're going to cook what I want, when I want, in the way that I want, and you're going to listen to this verse. Is it so that men always get what they want? That doesn't sound right, does it? God came and he sent Jesus to honor the church. In fact, those who order their women around like that have not read the verses that follow that we're going to deal with next week. I promise you that. In fact, many men love to read these verses and stop there. In fact, I'm sometimes okay with it because I know what's going to come next Sunday. And while preaching about women is hard for men, I'm going to tell you, preaching about the men's role is much harder. The church was not created by Jesus to be miserable and to be beaten into submission. The church is about joy and love and peace and security. The church is about becoming more like Jesus. And in a Christian marriage, such abusive action should not happen. The husband is absolutely accountable to God, as we're going to find out next week. This is not just about who makes decisions in the home, but about attitudes that permeate the relationship. Jesus submitted himself to the Father so that the Father could raise him up. I've heard this described as the dance of the Trinity. That Jesus offers his very self in submission so that he can be picked up by the Father. Jesus does not have duty coerced upon him. Instead, he comes in love. And instead, he offers his very self freely as a gift. I read a little bit earlier a passage we talked about a few weeks ago about the mystery in all this. And I said at that time that the mystery of marriage is not men trying to figure out women or women trying to figure out men. That is mysterious. But the mystery is this: as I act as a Christian, as I have attitudes more like Jesus, the higher I become in the kingdom of God. And women, as they become servants like Christ, as they fulfill their role in the church, as they fulfill their role, they become more like the church. Just as men fulfill their role, they become more like our sacrificed Lord. Domination in relationships is sin. Men in sin will try to dominate women, and women will try to dominate men at times. Never works out well for them all, because the man is stronger. And sometimes in sin, though, it'll go the other way. The women will allow men to dominate them in an unhealthy way. Spousal abuse is serious, and it is an abomination to God's created order. It is a disgrace to his creation. It is not allowed. And some have reacted to the abuse of men and said, well, therefore, women should trust men. Ever. It's unfortunate because it goes way too far. Husbands, as part of just who we are naturally independent. I'm going to tell you, we are not natural leaders in the home. We tend to hide. But women are protectors and pleaders. And a wife's role is to help her husband take on that unnatural role. It's hard. Because often, when a man does not take up his role, a woman's natural reaction is to sulk, or to gossip with her friends, or to start nagging her husband to do as she sees fit. That's certainly not God's way. Women often have a vision of where their husband should be like. It has been said often that when a young man and a young woman get together and get married, that the man looks at the woman and thinks, I hope she never changes. And the woman looks at her man and says, I hope he changes into this. And I'll help him along the way. The problem is, when you ever start with this idea of how you're going to change someone, does it ever work? No. Never. Ever. So how does this work? A wife's role is not to roll over. Her role is to help her husband to grow. To help him become who God has called him to be. And that gives women great power. You want your husband to be all he can be? Consider what it means to be a helper and a submitter. There's this crazy detail in the Christian message that one of the ways in which Jesus changes people is he gets down on his knees and he washes feet. That the Lord of the universe, in this symbolic act, submits and helps. That Christ can change lives by washing feet. And there is a fine line between being someone who nags all the time and being one who encourages one to be better. But that is the role that a wife is called to. That is the role to help a husband. Men will abscond responsibility for leadership. They'll flee from it. Yes, men will give orders. But there is a big difference between being somebody who's bossy and someone who is a leader. A leader needs to be someone who takes responsibility to lead others. And it is done in the context of relationships. And men are not naturally good at that. Men will give orders, but not take up leadership. We're talking about home, community, church, everywhere. And women have the role of coaxing their husbands not to run away from leadership. To gently moving them, encouraging them, defending them when necessary. To understand a little bit about how this works, we need to get to the second part of the service, but I'll say it's not like this. About the man who left work one Friday afternoon on payday. Instead of going home, spent his weekend with the boys at the bar and blew the whole paycheck. Finally reappeared at home Sunday night, confronted by an obviously angry wife, who for 2 hours berated him. Finally, his wife stopped and said, "How would you like it if you didn't see me for 2 or 3 days?" And unwisely, he said, "That'd be fine with me." Monday went by, he didn't see his wife. Tuesday went by, didn't see his wife. Wednesday, same thing. By Thursday, finally, the swelling had gone down enough that he could see her out of the corner of his eye. Men and women are very different. Women are like the church. God valued the church so much that he was willing to sacrifice everything for her. And women are compared to the church. God created you to be the gender that you are. And it is a gift. Next little bit, I'm going to rely a lot on Neil Anderson's book, Christ-Centered Marriage. It's a good book. If you ever want to read a good book on marriage. And I'm going to deal with some very simplistic explanations to complicated questions. So in other words, I know I'm oversimplifying here. I know I'm overstating. Men communicate by sharing information. Women by sharing feelings. Men's words try to solve problems. Women's words convey drama. Women thrive on communication, whereas men thrive on action. Women need a verbal relationship. Men look for partners in recreation and activities. Men prefer facts. Women prefer sentiments. I know those are gross oversimplifications, but they're probably pretty accurate too. They're rooted in some truth. Let's look at some of the differences, just to kind of understand. Think of a physical relationship between a man and a woman and how they approach it so differently. Men, when looking at sexuality in a healthy way, and men are often not good at looking at it in a healthy way, but when men are, they see the physical relationship that they have with their wife as a means to a deeper love and to be loved in a deeper way. In an unhealthy way, men approach it more as lust, and they approach it in a very different way than women would approach lust. That's why pornography is a great weakness for men. The male lust tends to be impersonal and about an ability to control and exploit for my own satisfaction and pleasure. Women, on the other hand, when approaching a physical relationship in a healthy manner, see sex as the culmination of love. See, right away we're starting at another end of the spectrum. One sees it as the beginning, and one sees it more at the end. One sees it as an effect, the other as a cause. When women approach it in an unhealthy manner, at least things like soap operas, romance books, fantasy worlds, and it is intensely personal and captivating, we approach it from very different points of view. When men and women come up against stress, as another example, we come at it from very different ways. Men tend to become irritable, to retreat to isolation. When men come up against stress, they tend to work more, watch TV more, do things to isolate themselves. Why? Because men tend to thrive on independence. And so when we're looking at a struggle, we tend to try to become less dependent, more independent. Women, I don't know. I was reading this week and trying to figure out how does this work with the women I know in my life. And I got to tell you, even I don't understand women's emotions. I don't think any man does. But so I'm going to rely on a book that said, it's like waves. It's kind of up and down, and as waves come out of stress, women need, when being swept over, to be able to release that pent-up stress, to be heard and understood. Because as they're heard and understood, the wave is allowed to go down gently. Men have the ability to help women with this, to love her as Christ loved the church, and to help her inner beauty develop and come out. The problem is, and this is a very big problem, and women need to understand this, that in both these examples and other examples we come up with, do you know what, women? We as men are incapable of fully understanding what we're supposed to do. I don't say it lightly as a joke, we just don't get it. We don't. Now, if women are the protectors, the helpers, and helping men take up their role in the family, and helping men take up their role as being like Christ to the church, guess what? You have to help us. And it gets very frustrating because about the 10th time you say, I just want you to listen to me. I don't want you to solve my problems. You get tired of saying it. But guess what? We don't ever get it. We're not wired the same way. And we as men have to patiently understand that when women tell us these things, they're helping to protect us, help us to be the best that we can be, because we have been called to a pretty important role. And women are protecting and helping us become the man that we have been called to be. Men have a role, and women help us to get there, like Christ in the church. Women, when a man goes off and he shuts off the world, you have to kind of pull him back and say, I just need you to listen to me for a couple of minutes. That's part of the role of being protector. Honestly, it is. We don't like it. I don't like it. I don't get it. I've been preaching about I don't get it. But we have a pretty amazing potential for a partnership where two that in many ways are not alike can each play a part so that they become more than they would be individually. That's how it should work out. And I know it doesn't always work that way, but when we trust Jesus and we deepen our relationship with Him first and foremost, and step by step He can take us to a better marriage. role of women is not a subservient role, but it is a servant role. It is one where they begin with this attitude of servanthood, in much the same way that Christ had an attitude of servanthood. And the amazing thing is, the more the women serve, the more powerful they become. The more they can influence their men. The more they can influence their world. The more that a difference can be made. In biblical terms, serving is very powerful. At least that's how Jesus did it. So next week, men, be warned. It's going to be a hard week because we're going to talk about our role. God moves us ahead, one step at a time.